it's good to see you guys. It's good to be together, and it's good to have this time together. And last week I sent home homework, and it had chapter 3 and chapter 4, and I got partway started in chapter 3, and it's kind of like, no, you need to slow down because there's too many good things that we're gonna miss in each chapter. So we're gonna take one chapter 3 at a time, 4, 5, and 6, and then we're gonna be shifting to the prophecy part of Daniel. So today we're just gonna cover chapter 3. And so if you did get a handout, and I'll email it out, you've got what we're gonna cover on chapter 4. So we have one more before spring break. So, and then we'll have that spring break week off, which is the 13th, yeah, so we won't meet that week. And, anyway. Okay, so turn with me to Daniel chapter 3. And I want to read the first 6 verses. Did somebody do that?
King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned
Here you go.
the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "Nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace."
Okay, so you probably should go on, and you don't even need to read all those instruments again and finish 7. We know there was a band playing.
Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of all those instruments
Yes.
and all kinds of music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up.
Okay, so in essence, what did Nebuchadnezzar do with his free time?
He made himself an image of himself and made everybody worship it.
Exactly. Okay, so that's what he did. And if they chose not to bow down, they had 2 options, right? So their option 1 was to bow down. What was option 2?
Thrown into the furnace.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, all right. So why do you think that Nebuchadnezzar played music?
Get their attention.
Okay, get their attention. What does music do?
Put you in a good mood.
Okay, put you in a can.
I need it, can too.
What else does music do?
Music's a form of worship.
Okay, can be a form of worship. Depends on which kind.
Can remind you of things.
Okay, they can. Music does take you. It's a reminder. Immediately puts you someplace,
Changes your
sometime,
focus.
what?
Changes your focus.
Okay, changes your focus. What does music impact?
Your emotions.
Yep. Your heart, your mind is kind of almost like a gateway inside to someone. And so that very well could be just to get people's attention, but it also could have another motivation behind it. Why would Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, if you read the chapter, we're going to see they defied the order, and we're going to get into that more in just a minute, but why do you think that they would defy the king's order under penalty of death?
They were fully committed to God.
They were fully committed to God, but think about, we know 2 reasons why they're in captivity. We haven't talked about one, but when we get farther in the book, we'll talk about one of them. But we have talked about the other one. Idolatry is exactly why they are in captivity, and so there's a message in there for them when they're faced with this choice. Okay? And how did we define idolatry a couple of weeks ago? What is idolatry?
Just whatever gets our focus.
Whatever's our focus. What other words can we use too to add to that?
What we worship.
What we worship can be. What we,
Takes us away from God.
okay,
Focus.
so away from God or between us and God. So that's what idolatry, and we spent some time on that a few lessons ago, and it certainly is not an archaic thing. It's something that we're challenged by today in our own lives. What did the king, he required 3 things. What 3 things did the king specifically require? Okay, you're gonna have to do something about my eraser, Elaine. Uh-oh. We have 1 week to figure that one out. It was like that last week too. I just forgot about it. There's 3 things that the king was gonna require of them. What were those 3 things? Say what?
Fall down
Fall down,
and worship.
worship. There's one other, and maybe we haven't read it, because it wasn't in every description. Is there another one in there?
Not on this one.
Okay. So look at 14, and what do we see there? There's one other requirement in verse 14.
Serve the gods.
Yep. So those are the 3 things that he required of them. So how would you define, why bow down? What does bowing down show?
Submission.
Uh-huh, that's exactly right. And you're getting closer and closer to the front.
I know, I'm feeling pretty good about it.
That's really good. Submission. What's it, worship mean? What are some words to describe worship?
Give all glory to?
Okay, glory,
Devotion.
devotion. What other words would we use?
Idolize.
Okay. Honor. And those are things that God is trying to get out of where? Inside of a person, or he's trying to draw out of a person. Where? Inside a person.
To a place of worship.
Huh?
You're asking what God's trying to do?
Well, God's trying to do the same thing with us, but he's also on this, in this scenario, is trying to draw that out of where? Inside of them. These things are coming from where?
Their hearts.
Yeah, exactly. So that's, he knew exactly what he was doing. He's pulling on their hearts to devote themselves to the statue that he created. So what about serve? That was the other thing that he required from them. Hey, what about serve? What's the other thing he required from them? What does that mean?
Be physical action.
Okay, there's some action. What else? So if you think of serving someone, what?
You do their bidding.
Okay,
Submission to.
yeah, there is a submission. You do your bidding. And you know, in this case, it's motivated by what?
Fear.
It is all, yeah, all of this is fear-based. That's exactly right, okay? So, if we look at I don't know, where do we see that they did not bow? Sorry.
17,
That's
16 or
low.
16.
Yeah, but that's round 2. So in round 1,
12.
thank you. Okay, and really, we don't know until that point, because what happens, and if let's read 8 through 12, because what happens is, let's read that, and then we'll talk about that.
Just that one verse.
8 through 12.
Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and
It's okay to say all those instruments.
with all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the gold image, and whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of the burning fury furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods and worship the gold image which you have set up.
Okay, so how did the king find out that they did not bow down? Yeah, exactly. They were tattled on, exactly. And it's interesting too, because it's a really strong word that says ate the pieces up, so they were really annoyed with those 4 guys. And as we continue through Daniel, we're gonna see there's animosity in these positions that people have, and they're jealous. And we already saw in chapter 1 that these 4, Daniel is not mentioned in chapter 3, and if I forget to bring it up, somebody bring it up. But these 4 guys, we saw last week in chapter 1 that what did Nebuchadnezzar say about them? Anybody
They were
remember?
the best. They were 10 times
There you go.
better than everybody else.
10 times better than everybody else. A good setup for jealousy and a good setup for competitiveness. And so as soon as they failed this test, immediately they went and routed them out. Okay? Why do you think Nebuchadnezzar built the image?
So when you asked the question a while back about why do you think he used music, it kind of ties in everything that you've been talking about now. Because I read verse 5 when he's talking about that. At the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, and he's saying when you hear this, then that's when you're to act, you're to bow down and worship. And when I looked that word "hear" up in the original translation, it's talking about. Sorry, I had it. It's talking about a feminine noun meaning horror, a horrible thing that is used to describe how bad the apostasy and apathy of the Israelite was. What they did in worshiping idols and prophesying falsely were truly horrible things in the eyes of God and the prophets who denounced them. So it's out of fear. So I think it's like a play on perversion of how God, like, he he wants us to worship out of fear, but the fear is not the same fear that Nebuchadnezzar is using in his image. And so it's like in the image of Christ, you're to worship, bow down, worship, and submit, but it's all out of different.
Respect.
Yes.
That's a good
And it's
point.
all out of love, not out of a forced relationship and forced worship. So I think this is just laying out the perversion of God's original plan and the enemy's original plan altogether. And I also think it's interesting how if they don't bow down and worship, he's gonna throw them into his lake of fire.
Yeah, those are really good parallels and really good insight into those verses. And you brought up something that God does not force relationship with us, where he is absolutely forcing that behavior. And he also knows to these.
And we can't force, it goes both ways, we can't force God in
Yeah.
a relationship either.
Yeah.
It's both ways.
So that's a really good, those are good points to
I was
read.
just saying that to say that I think that's why he used the image.
Okay,
Because that represents idolatry. That's representing instead of God, instead of worshiping God, you're worshiping an image, the epitome of idolatry.
Okay. and you're absolutely right, and he probably, and interesting too, and that we can go back, and we're gonna look at chapter 2 here in just a second. What was this statue made up of? Gold, okay, so turn back to chapter 2. And I wanna look at, what is the end of verse, remember this is the statue, this is the, and what is, at the end of verse 38, what do we find out about Nebuchadnezzar at the end of 38?
He's the head of gold.
He's the head of gold, but we saw different minerals in that statue, and yet when he makes his statue, his message is, what's his message?
It's all me.
It's all about me. That's exactly right. Okay, and we're gonna see, and you brought out the point that it's a forced allegiance, and there's a spiritual element to that to require worshiping and bowing down and serving. So that's an important point. And it's also interesting, and I'm not sure, I might be ahead of myself and I don't care, but if you look at verse 36 and 37, what do we find out in 38? What do we find about, so this is Daniel telling Nebuchadnezzar something about his relationship with God. What does he tell him?
That he's been given sovereignty, power, strength, and honor.
From?
God.
Yeah. So he's spelling out where he got his power. Okay, and what else is he doing? And this is a good backdrop for us continuing into chapter 3. What else is he telling him here?
He's gonna rule over the birds and the beasts and
Okay,
the people.
okay, and what else?
God has given him this, and God can take it away.
Okay, that is true.
God will take it away.
Yeah, right? You know, God, wait, let's go back. Look at verse 28. And let's see what we find out about his relationship with God in verse 28.
In 2 or chapter
2, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
However, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in later days. This was your dream and the visions in your mind while you were on your bed.
Okay, so that's kind of an important setup for what we're looking at in chapter 3. How would some of those things relate to the action that Nebuchadnezzar took in chapter 3 by setting up the statue?
Well, I guess I don't know what you're looking for, but he's basically countering what Daniel told him, specifically countering it, saying, no, I'm God.
He basically is saying, you said all that to me, thank you, I'll give God a big thumbs up, but now I'm gonna build my statue of gold. And it's really almost in defiance of,
Yeah.
I'm in charge and there's no one after me. By having the
He
whole,
kinda missed the point.
Yeah, he sure
of the
did.
trade game.
yeah, he sure did, okay?
You know, I thought about that reading through this, and I
Yeah.
thought, how bold
Yeah,
of him, I mean, I just think, how could you have went through the dream thing before,
yeah,
where you were gonna kill everyone?
yeah.
Cause they couldn't interpret it, and it's interpreted, and then you just slam the door, and I just don't get that, I mean, it just,
And we're gonna really look into that next week, what's behind that for him and his response.
And to me, it almost looks like the king embellishes the fact that God has given him the power and whatever. And so he says, okay, he's given me the power, then I'm gonna make me a statue and they're all gonna bow down to me.
Okay, so it could be that too, that could play into it. We don't specifically know, but we do know that statue is background for some of the things that are happening in chapter 3. We can see that pretty easily. Okay, so, and I want you to remember verse, I turned my page, I think it was 28, that, where he said, there's a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he's made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. Okay, so keep that in mind. So in the situation that they're in, what kind of pressure would you say that they're under?
A lot of pressure.
There is a lot of pressure, life and death, right?
Yeah.
And where is that pressure in relation to them? It's not really a great question, right? Look at me like that.
Sitting on top of them.
Well, they were really close to it because they're like governors of areas of that kingdom, and they're
Okay.
really close to the king.
Okay,
So they're probably like very familiar with his power and what he can do.
yeah, they work
When he
for
said
him
it-
day to
Yeah,
day,
they work for him day to day.
yeah,
So it's immediate and present danger.
okay.
Yeah.
And would you say this is external pressure?
It would be both.
Yeah, I agree with
Yeah.
that, yeah.
Okay,
Mostly external.
It's
though.
peer pressure, and then it's always challenging your faith with God.
okay. So there's definitely a pressure, you got a decision to make, here's what's coming at you, and here's your choices, 2 choices, okay, so that's, and then what do we see with them? They, obviously we know, they didn't bow, so what are they experiencing in the face of, whether it's internal and or external, what are they experiencing?
They have everyone's attention.
Okay, they do have everyone's attention. But what else are they experiencing to make that choice?
To make the choice?
Yeah,
Oh,
to not bow down.
conviction.
Okay, it's a conviction.
Trust.
And that leads into our next question, but I want us to see,
yeah, they're searching their soul,
okay,
is this really the deal?
yeah, and that's, you would have to say that that's what's going on. And to combat this pressure, there's something, so while they're searching their soul to see if this is the deal, what's happening inside of them?
It's probably absolute horror. I can
Could
only
be.
imagine.
Could be.
Or maybe just peace.
Or maybe they're just relying on God to see them through.
Yeah.
They're trusting outside forces.
And I think they'd be conflicted, they would have to be,
Okay,
I mean, I think they would be.
but they're experiencing something internally in order to come
Conflict.
to that, huh?
Conflict.
There may be conflict, we aren't told that there is, but being people, we can only imagine that that's part of it.
I think it's probably safe to say at some point there's conflict for them, but it may not be in this moment. Like if they've.
It may have been before,
they
we don't
are
know how long they
convicted,
waited.
Yeah, I mean, if they are convicted in this moment.
Yeah.
And they've kind of gone past that point of questioning, challenging her, and they're in that. Yeah, so it's kind of hard to make that assessment.
Well, and we don't know.
We really can't.
They've already decided what they're gonna do. I mean, they've decided that they're gonna.
Yeah, that's really all you
Face
know
death.
is what they didn't do.
Exactly, and what we do know is the internal was stronger than the external pressure. That's what we do know for them to make that choice. Okay, so thinking about that, there's one thing that they were afraid of. We've talked about fear. What is the one thing that they're afraid of?
Must be their God.
Okay,
Yeah, they feel.
Letting God down.
Disappointed
Yeah.
about everything.
Yeah.
okay, yeah, that's what I think that we need to think about. That was their greatest fear. And so for them to bow down, what would that be?
Basically,
Betrayal.
yeah, betraying.
Yeah,
their- yeah.
so they feared this more than they feared dying. That's what they feared. So let's turn to Daniel 1:8, and we saw this last week where they were in conflict. And what do we see? And you guys have already said it, but here we can get that insight from another situation. And what do we see in 8 when they were supposed to, they had a diet issue?
They asked if they could just ask the person who charges them if they could eat the foods that they're accustomed to instead of eating the king's food.
And that was the action they took. What do we see at the beginning of verse 8?
Daniel resolved not to defile himself.
Right.
Yeah, so we see that resolution, we see that inner conviction, whatever we want to call it, that inner inside winning out over the pressure on the outside. We've already seen that once, and now we're seeing it again. And for him to have ate that diet would have been a sin for him as well. And so or them as well. And so we're seeing that about them. And then, I want to look at Zechariah 4:6. And I want to think about, because sometimes we idolize people in the Bible who seem to have been like amazing. And so we tend to idolize them instead of really getting at the root of why did they respond this way. And in Zechariah 4:6, we get a really powerful reminder that affected them and affects us. What does Zechariah 4:6 say?
So he answered and said to me, This is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel, not by might nor by my power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts.
And so what do we know is part of that internal part of them? Part
God's
of their
really
life.
working.
Yeah, God's really working in them in their circumstance. Okay? So look at verse 15, and what does Nebuchadnezzar clearly recognize in verse 15? Would somebody read that? What? How about let's go to 3, maybe I didn't say it. How about,
Daniel?
yes, sir.
Oh.
3:15, you wanna go to another, you're right, that was a good, okay, you do wanna teach, right? Okay, Daniel 3:15, thank you.
Let me find
You're
it.
keeping me in line though, thank you, I didn't say that.
Now when you hear the sound of the horn flute, zithers, lyres, harp pipes, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue from my hand?
I should have had you read 14, would you go, because this is an exchange, I'm sorry, between Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the king. It's just those 3 guys and the king now. It's not everybody else that's around there, okay? And what do we find out that he says? He asks who in 14, go ahead and read that one in 3:14.
And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up?
Okay, so he's asking if it's true, then he goes through all the instruments, and then what does he tag on the very end of the instruments in verse 15?
If you do not worship it, you will immediately be thrown into the blazing furnace.
And then what's the last line?
Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?
Take that thought and what we just read in chapter 2.
He thinks he's above God.
Yeah. He's had a few days to think, he built that statue. He's kind of forgotten that exchange between him and God and what God told him through Daniel. And now he's putting the challenge out there and going, I'm bigger than God. It's really what he's saying to them.
Very arrogant, it's an enemy.
Yep, yep. Okay. So, you answered that question of what's attached to that. So, we did 2:26 through 28. That's where it was and not where I was thinking it was in our lesson. Okay, what does Nebuchadnezzar not understand about these three guys?
They don't care.
Okay, they don't care?
Their relationship with God.
He does not understand their relationship with God. And he does not, he's demanding stuff from them that would come from where? Where did we say the things he's demanding from them would come from where? Their heart. And what he does not understand about these three men is God owns their heart. That's not something he even remotely understood or factored in when he requested this of them.
You ordered it, didn't you?
Yeah, he did. I put it in there.
Well, yeah, I got you.
Okay, so in Daniel 3:15, Nebuchadnezzar does offer them another chance, and let's look at 16 and 17 and see how they respond to the chance.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king.
So what would, we'll stop there. So what's the tone and how they communicate with him?
Peace.
Okay, there's peace. And how do they treat Nebuchadnezzar?
With dignity.
He's being a jerk. But how do they treat him?
With dignity.
Yeah, they do. They speak to him very respectfully. And yet the respect only goes so far because they're gonna they did defy the order. Okay? And how do he's going, okay, I'm gonna give you a second to change your mind. We're gonna have that whole band play again. Would you read all that list for me? We're gonna let the band play again, and here you go, okay? So, and what do they say? What's their response? Thanks.
Thanks, but no.
Thanks, but no. Yeah, don't waste your time. And what do they say? Why? They give him a reason.
God will deliver them from the fires.
Uh-huh.
If it's his will. They also throw that out there. If it's his will.
Yep. And they declare things about God to him. He's telling what God would deliver you from my hand. Well, here they're going to declare some things about God to him. What are the things that they say?
They serve him.
Okay.
They believe that God can deliver them, or will deliver them out of the fire.
Does it say God is able? Or is that, am I stealing it from another verse? It does say it's able.
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
But it also says if he chooses not to, we'll still serve him.
Okay, and there you're a little bit ahead of me. Are you in 18?
Yeah, it is on.
Yeah, hang on.
Settle in.
Yeah, exactly. Still working for my pen, isn't he? Okay, and what do we see then? In order for them to say, nope, we don't need another chance, our God is able, what's the attitude of their heart?
Resolved, resolute.
Yeah. There's a resolution, resolute, and then there's also just a surrender to God's purpose. How much control do they have? None. And before I forget, why do you think Daniel's not mentioned in the chapter? Does that mean he bowed down?
No, he hasn't been caught yet.
He hasn't been caught yet.
They haven't been marked on yet, really.
That's a good thought. Any thoughts?
For some reason, I had the impression that they were in different locations. Same kingdom, but he was serving directly.
They were all
They weren't all four together, cause, I don't know, that was.
He was the teller of the dreams, and maybe the king was protecting him.
Okay,
Maybe.
maybe. We don't know. We don't know because he's not mentioned. He's not mentioned, so we don't know what happened to him. We don't know, but we do know because he's gonna face a similar situation farther down the road, and his response will be the same. And so we do know he might have got bussed out of town because Nebuchadnezzar didn't wanna deal with it. We don't know. Or maybe he thought if he separated Daniel from these guys, maybe they'd cave, because Daniel wasn't there, and he kinda was their leader. We don't know.
Or just throw it
Okay,
out there.
just throw it out there.
Could he have wanted to test their God again and just see what would happen? Just like with the whole dream situation in chapter 2.
What do you mean by
Now
that?
it's testing God again, like, is your God really real? It's probably not that deep, but I'm just saying, testing God in the sense that these
Oh,
three
gotcha.
are they actually gonna stand for their God? Just like
It
what
could be a
happened.
test for God, it could
But
be.
that's probably totally
We don't know.
not true.
He's probably out of town, is the guess, is Nebuchadnezzar knew what he was gonna do, shipped him out of town, probably. But we do know he would not, based on his character, based on how he's described, that he wasn't one of the people he would not have bowed down,
I
okay?
love his confidence.
What?
I love his confidence.
Mhm.
It's for me, I just saying, yeah, God's gonna take care of me, but I'll be praying on the
Yeah,
ground.
yeah, yeah.
But he had the confidence to,
They did,
yeah.
they did, and to
Yeah,
respond, see, I would be fearful too, and to respond, John.
Go back to chapter 2, verse 49. And it says, and Daniel made request to the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the administration of the province of Babylon, while Daniel was at the king's court.
Okay,
So evidently they were in different locations.
you were right then, thank you, and I forgot that. So thank you for bringing that up. And, but because all of these people are government officials that are here, he's still part of the government, you kinda think he would have been there or out of town. So, but thank you for bringing that up, that's a good
And I think that
clarification.
they would have the healthy fear that common people wouldn't have. I mean, like if you're a common person, you go meet the president, right? You're like, maybe not the one we have, but a president you. But the office itself, you know what I mean? It's like somebody off the street that would be kind of fearful what the president's gonna do. But if you're like a senator or a cabinet member, then you're not gonna have that same.
That's a good point.
You're gonna be like, hey, you'll be able to talk to the president different as in somebody like that came off the street.
Right,
So if you're these Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are like the president's cabinet members. you
right,
know,
right,
Members of the cabinet that they see a lot, and they're in charge of the kingdom of Babylon,
right,
which is the main kingdom that Nebuchadnezzar's over. It's not like they're the mayor of Midland County. That's like they're the president, they're the governor of Texas.
okay, that's a
And
good
then
point.
he would be the president of the United States, kinda like that.
Yep, that's a good point.
I think one thing that interests me in verse 17 is, he does tell the king that the God is able to deliver us from the furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hands, because the king had just said, no God can deliver you out of my hands.
Yeah, and that took
And he is confident that
yeah.
even if he goes into the furnace,
Yeah. And there is a lot of courage to be able to say to that person, his life and death in his hands, your life and death, and it is very courageous and again, God gave them the courage for the moment. Okay? Turn to, real quick, to 1 Corinthians 6, 19 through 20, because I think this is really at the heart, yes, this is a New Testament verse, but it's really at the heart of what God is doing inside of them. And what does 1 Corinthians 6, 19 and 20 say?
or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit whom is in you, whom you have from God, and that you are not your own? For you have been bought with a price, therefore glorify God in your body.
And isn't that really what they're doing? They really do know that they're God's, that they're His, and that they're their circumstances are in his hands, and they're willing to surrender their body because why? Why?
They don't consider it their own.
Yeah. And the reason they could do that is they'd already surrendered their heart. Okay. Let's go on and let's look at verse 18. And let's see what else they say to Nebuchadnezzar. And I think this is one of the very powerful verses in the Bible that kind of gets buried in the Old Testament. But it's a really important verse. And what does 18 tell us?
But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, Your Majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up.
Okay, so what do they believe? If we tie 17 and 18 together, what do we know that they believe?
God will save us.
God will save us. Okay?
And we'll never worship the idol you set up.
Okay, we're not gonna worship, won't worship your gods. What else?
It's not gonna, it doesn't change even if he doesn't
Okay,
save us.
nothing changes. And they're really saying, well, let's come back. Okay, so nothing changes. What else?
They're not making any conditions with God.
Yep.
Deliverance or martyrdom are equally possible in his plan.
Yep.
I read that from my study Bible.
Good job, John. It is true. It really is true. This is a life and death situation that they're in. And they have come to the place in this life and death situation that they know God has the power to deliver them. And they do know He will deliver them one way or another. And nothing changes. Whatever God does, nothing changes.
Can't help but think about Jesus being tested. I don't know, it's just what my mind keeps going to when I think about this in the New Testament. Just all the different opportunities for him to, and then also kind of people challenging him to want to prove God. I don't know. That's what comes to mind for me.
So that word "but" is such an important word in at the beginning of 18, because they've said all these things that they know are true of God. And then "but" comes in there, and what do they say? We do have it up here. But what do they say? But even if he does not. Yeah.
They know God's gonna deliver them, whether they burn in the furnace or not.
Right.
So we're not into your deal.
Yeah.
No matter what.
Yeah. But and this is such a, why is this such a indicator of faith? And why is it important for us to think about that?
They don't care about what people think. I mean, they're saying their God's bigger, so regardless of what happens to them, it's not relevant to them. I mean, they're looking way past this plateau.
That is true. They are looking way past this situation, and they boiled it down to themselves and to God. Okay, but when they say nothing changes, God can deliver us. He's able to. But even if he does not, and they're saying nothing changes. That's a hard statement.
They're wholly committed to God, regardless of what God's direction or path may be.
And so what's part of that? What's part of this nothing changes? We talked about their heart. We talked about their mind. What is part of this?
Their God's untouchable to them.
Okay, he is
the king
untouchable.
has no influence over their God.
And that is true. But inside of them, what are they also saying?
They have their faith that God can save them.
Okay, there's faith. And I think sometimes this is where we struggle because we have a will. We have a will. And maybe it's just me, but sometimes I've wrestled and struggled with God's will and my will. And here we show that surrender means their will is God focused. Their will is under His authority. And they could mean this as if they had surrendered their heart, their mind, and their will to His plan in their situation. This is not their first fiery furnace, right? We read chapter 1, we know some things about them already. And what are the things that we know about them already? What kinds of things have they been through? And they're young.
The destruction of Israel.
Okay, so what happened to them?
They were captured and
Yeah.
taken to Babylon.
And they're young, though, so they're somewhere between 15 and 18 is estimates, okay? They're captured, they've already been taken to a foreign country, and that means at that age group, who's not with them?
Their parents.
Exactly, their family. They had each other, fortunately. What other things have we seen them go through already? What else did they do in that first chapter?
You have to go to school and
They went-
assimilate
yep.
and learn and languages.
Yep, they went to school for 3 years to try to make them like a Babylonian. And then what else did we see in chapter 2 regarding the dream? What was going on there if people that couldn't come up with the dream and the interpretation of the dream, what was going to happen?
Killed.
Man, you'd think you'd almost get inoculated after a while. Every chapter, you're going to be
You're
killed,
gonna
you're
be
going to be
killed.
killed, you're
You're
going to
gonna die, you're gonna die, you're gonna die.
So they've already survived one death threat. So they're dealing with, what would we call that stuff?
Trauma,
Yeah, okay.
torture.
Pressure, trauma, and the emotions that go with those situations that they were legitimately facing.
They're already smarter than King Nebuchadnezzar, though.
Right?
Before they went to school.
Right? That's true. He said they were 10 times better than his people, and not himself. Okay, so let's read 19 through 21, and let's see how well Nebuchadnezzar took their no thank you, sir.
Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. Then he ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments.
Okay, so how was Nebuchadnezzar, how did he receive their no, sir?
I'll show you.
Huh? Exactly. And he was mad.
Not real pretty.
No. He was mad and his countenance was changed and he cranked up the heat, okay? And he threw him in, and let's read 24 and 25.
But suddenly Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes, your majesty, we certainly did," they replied. "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men unbound, walking around in the fire, unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god."
Okay, so what do we see happen? They are delivered. And what else do we see?
Somebody else is in it.
Yeah, exactly. They're delivered. And what else happened to them?
Unbound.
They're unbound, walking in the fire. And you know, I think sometimes it's a shame that we all hear these stories. If we've grown up in church and we hear a story like this, and we're told over and over and over again, and we automatically go to the miraculous event that they did not burn in the fire. But we really don't know what happened and why they ended up in the fire in the first place. Who do you think let me see, Nebuchadnezzar says who he thinks. Look at 28. Nebuchadnezzar says who he thinks he saw in the fire. What does he say?
God's angel.
An angel. There's 2 options. We don't know because God doesn't tell us. The other one is a pre-incarnate Christ that was with them, and there are a couple of times we see that are called theophanies, and we see a pre-incarnate Christ that happens, but we don't know. And it really doesn't matter because we know for sure the presence represented what? God.
Yeah.
He was with them in the fire. Let's see, look at 27, let's see what happens next.
Verse 20.
Yeah, you can skip all the, and then notice, the government officials, they saw all this. This didn't happen in a little isolated corner. All these government officials saw it, so you can skip the government officials' names.
Okay. And they all saw in regard to these men that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, nor was the hair of their heads singed, nor was their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them.
Okay, so why take the time to say all these people are there, the king saw them, why take the time to spell all that out? It was witnessed.
By important people too,
By
not
important-
by like people you could ignore.
Exactly, and not people that were really friends because they ratted you out just a few minutes ago, right?
Right.
Okay, so it also gives us a really important message about God's deliverance of these three men. What is that message?
It's about God.
Remember, what did they say? God can, He's able to deliver us. And He will deliver us. They were assured of that. And what is that showing us about that part between them and God?
Gotta get that part figured out.
Huh?
Said we gotta get that part figured out, but it's hard. It's just hard to get that dialed in.
It is true. That is a true statement. But in their situation and in their case, we see God fully, completely, totally, any other words we can come up with, delivered them. So much so, they made a point to say, hey, we smelled their hair.
Didn't even smell it.
Didn't even smell, and we all know, because we've smelled singed hair before, right?
Well, you know, and the king, earlier, when he talks about throwing them in the furnace, he says, what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?
Right.
Well, this is the God.
Yeah.
That's bigger than the king.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if he realizes that, but.
I don't know if he does either, but I think there's a point where he's gonna realize that, and we haven't got to that point, we won't get to that in this chapter. So Ed, I know you're a fireman, was there ever a fire like that you just was intimidating to you?
Yes.
And?
You mean that I walked through and I didn't smell like fire?
And you had three friends with you?
And
No.
we just kinda walked through there? and
Yeah.
everything else?
No, that didn't happen, okay. But I just thought about you being a fireman, even with your gear on, and facing that, and what kind of feelings or emotions or thoughts would
It's-
go on inside.
Well, I mean, it wouldn't be the same, but I mean, you have a certain amount of respect. for
Yeah,
fire,
sobering.
And fear.
Yeah.
Is kind of there. The big thing that, not being touched, in a fire, just one gulp of air and you're done. I mean, it talked about the people that brought them up there
They
died
died,
throwing
right.
them in.
Right.
But the big thing is after you've been in a fire, irregardless, you smell like fire for 3 or 4 days. And every time you take a shower, you're reliving it. I mean, you smell it.
That's interesting.
I mean, for them to say that they didn't smell
Sinus
like it.
membranes and everything,
So it's a real contrast, it's a real miracle.
Yeah.
Okay, let's read 28 through 30, let's see how Nebuchadnezzar now responds to them.
Then Nebuchadnezzar said, Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble.
Lest we think he converted, right?
Yeah. For no other God can save in this way. Is that all?
Yeah, and then just 3 in 30 they were rewarded. What were they rewarded with? Where they continued to prosper. Yeah, in Babylon. Okay, so at this point in the Bible, we never hear anything about them again. We've talked about the power of their story. And what we know is millions of people have heard their story. And it was included purposely, intentionally by God into the Bible. So I want to finish here in just a minute, but I want to answer this question. What do you think shaped Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? We've been talking all over. I just want to make kind of a list up here, and I want us to look at that as we think about our own lives. What shaped Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego?
Before you do that though,
What?
make no mistake about it, he said to respect the God of their God.
Yes.
And he did not tear down his image.
Okay, there's a point.
And he didn't tell them they couldn't, not to worship his image.
Okay, there's a
They
point.
just couldn't talk bad about
Yeah,
theirs.
so, but you know, their belief system, they had room for lots of gods, right?
Right.
So that may have been part of what
Sure,
you're hitting.
you're right.
I think the miss is there in the fact that he calls it the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Yes.
He hadn't realized it unless he said
It's
he's
not his
God.
God.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there you go. Yeah. Okay, so again, look back at what we've already talked about and think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. What made them respond in the way that they did? What made them respond?
Number one has to be a fear of God, I think.
Okay? So they had a healthy respect or fear of God. And that was part of their relationship with God. They knew he was God, and they were not. What else?
Obedience.
Faith.
Obedience.
There was obedience. They knew truth. Remember
E-N-C-E.
it. Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
E. E.
Yeah, E.
Thank you.
R.
Stop. Okay. They knew, so obedience, and they knew the truth. And we know that their parents were part of a revival in the nation of Israel. Okay? And that's why they took that so seriously, because they knew that's why they were in captivity. What else do we know about them and what played into their situation? We looked at the fact they've already seen some adversity before. Wouldn't you think that they passed the test in chapter 1 and chapter 2 and now chapter 3 they're facing another test? What are we learning about that?
There's always gonna be more tests.
Oh. Right?
Satan doesn't give up.
Okay, the enemy doesn't give up. And so what did those tests do? What did those tests do? Huh?
It's strengthened.
Okay, it strengthened.
It fortified all the previous things that shaped them.
Okay, it shaped them. It grew them, whatever we want to say.
That's where their faith became real. Even though it's
Okay.
real for them, there are those moments where faith, it's no longer faith, there's a transaction that occurs.
Their faith was real. And this put it on display. And that was part for them to see, for other people to see. But adversity does that. That's kind of a bummer. But that's really part of the message of this chapter and so far into the book, is that adversity is going to be part of our lives, and we need that adversity in our life. Because these are that we can look at those guys and we know how it's going to end, and so we can kind of go, okay, we don't really get caught up in it. We've talked about all the details of it. But at the end of the day, the faith becomes real when we act on it. We trust God. We surrender our will to Him and let Him do what He wants to do. No conditions. No conditions. And that's what they show us. And that's where God is leading us.
Well, I think you just said it. Their will was so surrendered totally and wholly. I mean, you had mentioned that earlier. That was one of those at your list there, is their will was
And then passing that trial, you can lean on that, that's
That's
a
a memory there.
big deal.
Good, that's a
Yeah.
good point. So in that fire, which we often reject, maybe it's just me, that's where they were set free. And those are the things that we need to remember as we go through our challenges and our struggles. It's in that fire that we're gonna start to know our God even more and be set free from the things that entangle us in this life. I wanna read, a couple of verses and then we're gonna quit. But Romans 15:4 tells us, He wrote things down ahead of time so that we can have encouragement and hope. This is not just a kid's story for what used to be a flannel graph when I grew up, so I'm dating myself. And some of you in here.
Used to be a what?
I
didn't hear what you said.
A flannel graph. No idea.
I know what a lithograph is.
Yeah, no. So literally you had felt and you had
Okay.
little characters that you put on the
Okay.
felt.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so some of us in here grew up with that, right?
Yeah.
Yep, okay. So, but what does Romans 15:4 say? And let's read these verses and then we'll be done, and we won't play myself.
For everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through the endurance taught in the scriptures and the encouragement they provide, we might have hope.
So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel 2 showed what did they show? What was in their character as they faced these challenges? According to, there's 3 words I want to pull out of 15:4.
Endurance.
They showed endurance. And we get weary. But God's trying to get us to a place of endurance, to the challenges and tests. And then, when we see other people go through other things, it's supposed to, reading their story is supposed to do what? Encourage us in our own battle. And give us hope in our own battle. Okay? And then I want to read Hebrews 12:1 and 2. Would somebody turn there and read Hebrews 12:1 and 2? We read this so much in our last study, 2 studies ago, that it will be familiar to whoever did it. What does Hebrews 12:1 and 2 tell us?
Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up, and let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame. Now he is seated in the place of honor beside God's throne.
Okay. What do we have? How does he start that first verse? We have what?
Witnesses.
We have witnesses that have gone before us, and they're telling us how to live and how to face our challenges and our struggles, and that's why their stories are in the Bible. That's why Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's story is in the Bible. They're witnesses that have gone before us to tell us how to live. And they do tell us, and what else do they tell us according to that verse? To do what? What are we supposed to do?
Recognize our traps, our sin traps, and lay them down.
Okay, and so he says, lay aside every encumbrance and the sin that so easily entangles us, and to do what? Run with endurance the race that is set before us. Each one of us have a race that is set before us. And there's encouragement because other people have endured. And then, what's the next thing? Fix our eyes on Jesus. And then, we won't look it up, but Hebrews 13:5b says, I will never leave you or forsake you. And that 4th person in the fire reminds us. And there are 5 no's in that verse. I will not ever leave you or not forsake you. And it's so important for us to be assured that no matter what we're going through, and the enemy wants to bring a message to us, God's left you. God's abandoned you. And so their story reminds us that God's with us, and God reminds us He's with us.
All
And
this sounds very familiar to the book of Job.
Does it? Yes, it does. It does. It does. Okay, so any other thoughts? before we close.
Well, you know, just like you were saying earlier about Jesus being, you know, the old devil. I mean, I was thinking of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Surely the old devil was saying, "I'll just go ahead and bow down. It's not that big deal." You know, the devil's saying that to them.
Absolutely.
They had that they had to have that going on.
Absolutely, and that's that spiritual war of the external, that's part of that external pressure, and that internal. And that the enemy is communicating into the circumstance that we're in. And we experience those things in our own lives. And I like the fact, maybe it's just me, I like to figure stuff out, or I try to figure out all the ways something can happen, how it could get fixed, how this could get, and no, they don't do it. They don't do it. They don't put anything on God. God, you got this, and you're gonna do it your way, and we trust you.
The hard part sometimes is knowing what your role is in that. Because you can still have trust in God, but it's tricky to know where you go, where you stop. It's hard. That's hard.
It can be, but I also think between us and God, they really do model that role between us and God.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts? One of my favorite people is Darlene Rose, and she was a missionary. My boys probably would know her story because they had to listen to it 5,000 times in the car. And what I liked about her story is she survived. She was a missionary in New Guinea. She survived the Japanese internment. She was taken captive by the Japanese and was in POW, and then she was on death row, and she was treated really badly. And that lasted 4 years. Her husband died while they'd only been married 2 years. And this is what she said when she finally got home. Later on, she said, those were not the worst days of my life. They were the sweetest days God gave me. It was there He taught me that He would never leave me or forsake me. And in our struggles and challenges, that's part of what God is trying to teach us. Anybody else? Thanks, you guys. Let me pray and we'll be done. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much that you use stories. Help us to remember that it's not just the stories, that our lives are stories, and that you want to use our story as well. Help us to learn from these guys and the things that we need to hang on to and remember and remind ourselves and each other of, and that you're always with us, that you work through adversity, and that you're deepening our faith and trust in our relationship with you. Please continue to build that in each one of us and help us to cooperate with our heart, our mind, and our will. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
No song, Jen?
No song, Don.